Something unusual is happening in Washington right now, and it's not just another round of political arguing. For years, Americans have become used to hearing the word impeachment. It almost feels like a permanent feature of modern politics. But what happened inside the House of Representatives recently has sparked a new debate, not because impeachment was mentioned again, but because of the number of lawmakers who were willing to officially put their names behind moving the conversation forward. And that's where things get interesting. A lot of headlines made it sound like Congress was on the verge of launching another impeachment proceeding against Donald Trump. Other headlines dismissed the entire thing as political theater. But when you actually look at what happened, the story is much more complicated than either side wants to admit. The real story isn't about a dramatic vote that suddenly changes everything overnight. The real story is about what that vote reveals about Congress, about the Democratic Party, about Trump's second term, and about the way accountability works in a political system that is more divided than at any point in recent memory. Because beneath all the shouting, all the social media reactions, and all the partisan talking points, there's a deeper question emerging. What happens when a large group of lawmakers genuinely believes action is necessary, but the political system makes that action almost impossible to achieve? That question sits at the center of this entire debate. Let's start with something most people overlook. When people hear that lawmakers voted on impeachment-related measures, many assume Congress was directly voting to impeach a president. That's not what happened. The vote that generated so much attention was procedural, but procedural votes in Congress often tell you far more than the headlines suggest. A procedural vote can reveal where members stand politically before leadership is ready to openly engage in a larger battle. It can expose divisions inside a party. It can show momentum building long before the public notices. And that's exactly why political observers paid attention. A significant number of House Democrats chose to go on record supporting further consideration of impeachment-related articles rather than allowing them to quietly disappear. That distinction matters a lot, because in Washington, official recorded votes carry weight that public statements do not. A member of Congress can go on television and make a passionate argument. They can post on social media. They can issue press releases. But a recorded vote becomes part of the permanent congressional record. Years later, people can still point back to that vote and say, you supported this or you opposed this. That's why these moments matter. Now here's the twist. The biggest story may not actually be Donald Trump. It may be the Democratic Party itself. For months, political analysts have been watching an increasingly visible divide emerge among Democrats. On one side are lawmakers who believe aggressive action is necessary now. Their argument is relatively straightforward. They believe there are enough concerns, enough controversies, enough constitutional questions, and enough ongoing disputes to justify immediate action. From their perspective, waiting only makes the problem worse. They argue that accountability delayed becomes accountability denied. On the other side are Democratic leaders and strategists who see the situation differently. They aren't necessarily saying concerns don't exist. Instead, they're asking a different question. What happens if another impeachment effort fails? What happens if months of political energy are invested into a process that ultimately ends exactly where previous efforts ended? That's where the tension really comes from. Because both sides believe they're protecting democratic institutions. Both sides believe they're acting responsibly. They simply disagree on the best strategy. One side views urgency as essential. The other views patience as necessary. And when those two instincts collide, political conflict becomes unavoidable. Most people never realize this, but congressional leadership often thinks several moves ahead. While activists, commentators, and voters focus on what is happening today, leadership teams frequently focus on what might happen 1 year from now, or even 2 years from now. They're looking at congressional maps, they're looking at vulnerable districts, they're looking at polling data, they're looking at Senate math, they're looking at electoral consequences. And those calculations matter because impeachment is not just a legal or constitutional process, it is also a political process. The Constitution provides the framework. Politics determines whether the framework can actually be used. That's one of the realities many Americans find frustrating. The public often wants clear answers. Either something is impeachable or it isn't. Either action should happen or it shouldn't. Washington rarely works that way. Instead, lawmakers are constantly balancing constitutional arguments, public opinion, electoral risk, party unity, media narratives, and institutional consequences, all at the same time. And that balancing act is exactly what we're seeing right now. Here's the part most people misunderstand. Many Americans assume impeachment is primarily about removal from office. Historically, that makes sense. The impeachment power was designed as a safeguard against serious abuses of authority. But modern politics has changed the way many lawmakers think about impeachment. For some members of Congress, impeachment is no longer viewed only as a pathway to removal. It's increasingly viewed as a formal statement of institutional judgment. In other words, even if conviction is unlikely, some lawmakers believe the act of impeachment itself serves an important purpose. It creates an official record. It signals congressional opposition. It establishes constitutional boundaries. Whether people agree with that approach or not, it helps explain why impeachment discussions continue even when the chances of removal appear extremely low. This shift has quietly transformed American politics, and it has happened gradually enough that many people haven't fully noticed it. A generation ago, impeachment was treated as an extraordinary event, something rare, something historic, something reserved for the most exceptional circumstances. Today, the conversation looks very different. Political norms have evolved, expectations have evolved, the public's familiarity with impeachment has evolved, and that evolution carries consequences. Some observers argue that making impeachment more common strengthens accountability. Others argue it weakens the power of impeachment by making it feel routine. Both arguments have gained supporters, and both arguments are likely to continue for years. The surprising part is that this debate isn't really about one politician. It's about the future of constitutional accountability itself. Think about the broader environment. Trust in institutions has declined. Political polarization remains intense. Americans increasingly consume information from entirely different media ecosystems. People often disagree not only about solutions, but about the underlying facts themselves. In that environment, every constitutional mechanism becomes harder to use effectively, because constitutional systems ultimately depend on some level of shared agreement. Shared standards, shared expectations, shared legitimacy. When those things weaken, every accountability mechanism begins to struggle. That includes impeachment. Now let's talk about why so many lawmakers feel pressure from their own voters. This is a crucial piece of the story. Members of Congress do not operate in isolation. They hear from constituents every day. They hear from activists, they hear from donors, they hear from local officials, they hear from advocacy organizations, and increasingly, they hear from highly engaged online communities. Many voters are no longer satisfied with symbolic opposition. They want visible action, they want clear confrontation, they want elected officials to demonstrate that they are fighting. That demand creates enormous pressure on lawmakers, especially those representing districts where voters overwhelmingly support stronger action. For some representatives, failing to act aggressively can create political risks at home. For others, acting too aggressively creates political risks, and that means lawmakers often face competing pressures depending on where they serve and who elected them. That's why votes that appear straightforward from the outside often involve complicated political calculations behind the scenes. Here's where things get even more fascinating. The debate isn't only about whether impeachment should happen, it's also about timing. Timing may actually be the most important disagreement of all. Supporters of immediate action often argue that waiting sends the wrong message. From their perspective, delay creates the appearance of acceptance. If conduct is serious enough to justify concern, they argue, then action should follow quickly. Supporters of a slower approach view timing differently. They argue that major constitutional actions carry greater legitimacy when supported by extensive investigation, documentation, and public understanding. In their view, acting too quickly can undermine the credibility of the process itself. Notice something important. Neither argument is inherently irrational. Both sides are trying to answer the same question. How should democratic institutions respond during moments of intense political conflict? They simply arrive at different conclusions, And that disagreement is shaping much of what we're witnessing on Capitol Hill today. Now, here's the detail that changes the entire perspective. The long-term significance of these votes may depend less on today's Congress and more on future elections. That's because control of the House remains one of the most important factors in determining what happens next. Congressional majorities matter, committee chairs matter, leadership decisions matter. Floor schedules matter. The public often focuses on individual lawmakers, but institutional power frequently determines outcomes. If future elections alter the balance of power, debates that currently seem theoretical could suddenly become operational. Ideas that exist today as political pressure could become actual legislative decisions tomorrow. That's why both parties are paying close attention, not just to current controversies, but to future possibilities. And that future uncertainty is fueling much of the current tension. Some commentators believe we're watching the early stages of a much larger constitutional struggle. Others believe the current debate will eventually fade as new issues dominate the political landscape. Nobody knows for certain. What we do know is that the underlying disagreements aren't disappearing. Questions about executive power, questions about congressional oversight, questions about constitutional accountability, questions about political norms. Those debates existed before Donald Trump. They will exist after Donald Trump. And the answers will shape American politics for decades. One thing that often gets lost in partisan discussions is that constitutional systems were never designed for perfect conditions. They were designed to function amid disagreement. The framers expected conflict, they expected competing interests, they expected political rivalry. What they could never fully anticipate was the degree of polarization that modern technology, modern media, and modern political culture would eventually create. That's why current debates sometimes feel so intense. The system is being asked to operate under conditions that test its assumptions, and people across the political spectrum are drawing very different conclusions about how well it's performing. Some believe existing institutions are proving resilient, others believe those institutions are showing signs of strain. Both perspectives have evidence supporting them, and both perspectives continue shaping political behavior. Let's take a step back and look at the bigger picture. When historians eventually study this era, they may spend less time discussing individual votes and more time discussing what those votes revealed. They may ask why trust became so fragile. They may ask why accountability became so contentious. They may ask why constitutional mechanisms increasingly became arenas for partisan conflict. And they may ask how political leaders adapted to a period of extraordinary polarization. Those questions are larger than any single impeachment debate. They're larger than any single administration. They're larger than any single election. They're questions about democratic governance itself. And that's why these developments continue attracting so much attention. Not because everyone expects immediate dramatic change, but because they reveal deeper tensions already present beneath the surface. The tension between urgency and caution. The tension between principle and strategy. The tension between accountability and practicality. The tension between constitutional ideals and political realities. Those tensions aren't going away. If anything, they appear to be becoming more visible, and that visibility may be the most important story of all. Because whether people support stronger action, oppose stronger action, or simply feel exhausted by constant political conflict, the underlying debate forces Americans to confront fundamental questions about how democratic institutions should function during periods of intense division. That's ultimately why these congressional fights matter. Not because every procedural vote changes history. Most don't. But because some votes reveal where political energy is building. Some votes reveal emerging fault lines. Some votes reveal tensions that may eventually shape larger decisions. And right now, Washington appears to be entering one of those moments. A moment where the debate extends far beyond a single vote. A moment where competing visions of accountability are colliding. A moment where political strategy, constitutional interpretation, and institutional power are all intersecting at the same time. Where that leads remains uncertain. But the fact that the debate has reached this point tells us something important. The conversation is no longer just about personalities. It's about the rules, It's about the institutions. It's about how a constitutional democracy responds when political divisions become this deep. And regardless of where anyone stands politically, that's a discussion that will continue long after today's headlines disappear. If you found this helpful, consider subscribing. I appreciate you.
Dim the lights for a moment. Turn on a fan if you have one nearby. Get comfortable, because tonight we are traveling somewhere that looks beautiful but feels like a slow suffocation. We are going to the Kingdom of Jerusalem in the 12th century, and we are going to meet a boy who should have never survived his own childhood, let alone become one of the most terrifying rulers his enemies ever faced. But before we do that, let me ask you something honest. If you are the kind of person who watches documentaries while scrolling through your phone, this might not be for you. That is not me being dramatic. That is me telling you that what we are about to explore requires a certain kind of attention. The quiet kind. The kind where you actually sit with history instead of consuming it like fast food. So if that sounds like your version of a good time, go ahead and subscribe. Not because I asked you to, but because you genuinely enjoy what I do here. The algorithm does not care either way. But I do. Now, let us talk about a king who wore gloves to hide what was happening to his hands. A king who led armies while his own body quietly betrayed him. A king who died at 24 but somehow accomplished more than most people do in 80 years. And then let us talk about why you, specifically, would not survive a single day in his life. We are going to do something unusual right at the start. Instead of telling you about Baldwin IV, we are going to put you inside his body, not his soul, not his mind, his actual physical existence. Because once you understand what it felt like to be him, everything else makes terrible, beautiful sense. You were born in the summer of 1161 inside a castle that smelled of stone, smoke, and too many people living too close together. Your father was King Amalric of Jerusalem. Your mother was Agnes of Courtenay, and she was quickly pushed aside because the nobles did not like her, which is already a catastrophic opening move if your goal is to live peacefully. Welcome to medieval politics. Your existence was considered a problem before you could even hold up your own head. Childhood in the 12th century was not childhood as we understand it. There were no gentle parenting books, no car seats, no pediatricians. There was only survival, prayer, and the constant awareness that half the people you loved might die before you learned to read. You were raised by servants who were probably exhausted. You were taught to ride a horse before you turned 5. You learned to hold a sword when your hands were still too small to wrap around the grip properly. And somewhere in the middle of all this, you started dropping things. At first, no one noticed. Children drop things constantly, but you dropped objects more often than your friends. You dropped cups during meals. You dropped wooden practice swords during training. Your nurse probably laughed about it. You probably laughed about it. But then you noticed something else. Parts of your body started feeling strange. Not painful exactly. Numb. As if your own skin had decided to stop talking to your brain. You would touch something warm and barely feel it. You would pick up a piece of bread and not realize how hard you were squeezing until it crumbled in your fingers. And because you were a child, you assumed this was normal. You assumed everyone felt this way. That is the cruelest part of leprosy. It does not announce itself. It just quietly begins shutting down the communication lines between your nerves and your brain, like a cruel craftsman carefully taking apart a machine while you are still using it. By the time you turned 9, the people around you started noticing. Your tutor watched you struggle to grip a quill properly. Your riding instructor watched you nearly fall during simple maneuvers. And someone, probably a court physician who had seen this before, began to suspect the truth. But no one said it out loud, because saying it out loud would mean admitting that the heir to the Kingdom of Jerusalem was slowly becoming untouchable. Leprosy in the 12th century was not just a medical condition, it was a spiritual catastrophe. People believed it was God punishing you for sins you had committed or sins your parents had committed. They believed you were rotting while still alive because you had done something so terrible that divine justice required you to suffer publicly. You would be separated from your family. You would be declared legally dead. You would ring a bell everywhere you walked so healthy people could avoid you. You would wear special clothing that marked you as unclean. And eventually, when your body had deteriorated enough, you would be placed in a leper colony and forgotten. That was the fate waiting for a 9-year-old boy who had done nothing wrong except exist inside a body that had betrayed him. But something unusual happened. Your father, King Amalric, refused to accept the diagnosis. Not because he loved you too much to let you go. Medieval kings loved their children in complicated ways. But because admitting you had leprosy meant admitting his dynasty was collapsing. The Kingdom of Jerusalem was already surrounded by enemies. The great Muslim leader Saladin was consolidating power. The Crusader states were constantly bickering with each other. And now the heir to the throne might be a leper? That kind of news would destroy the kingdom before any army even attacked. So your father did what any desperate medieval king would do. He pretended nothing was wrong. He kept you training. He kept you studying. He kept you appearing in public as if you were a perfectly healthy young prince who just happened to drop his sword sometimes. And for a while, the lie worked because people see what they want to see. And what the nobles of Jerusalem wanted to see was a strong, capable heir who would grow into a strong, capable king. Then your father died. You were 13 years old. You were a child. You were a child whose body was slowly shutting down. And suddenly, you were King Baldwin IV of Jerusalem, ruler of a fragile kingdom surrounded by enemies who were absolutely going to test you the moment they smelled weakness. And oh, they smelled it. Let us pause here for a moment and talk about what it actually means to be a king. Not the fairy tale version, not the movies where everyone bows and speaks in respectful whispers. The real version. Being a medieval king meant you woke up every morning to a room full of people who either wanted something from you, wanted to use you, or wanted to replace you. You had no privacy. None. You ate in front of people. You prayed in front of people. You used the bathroom in front of people because someone had to make sure you were not being poisoned. Your entire existence was a performance. And if you showed weakness for even a second, the vultures started circling. And you were 13. And you had leprosy. And your own nervous system had essentially stopped sending customer support updates. The first thing the nobles did was try to control you. They appointed regents. They argued about who should manage the kingdom while you were too young and too sick to rule properly. They treated you like a puppet who would sit on the throne while they pulled the strings. And here is where the story starts becoming interesting, because Baldwin IV was not a puppet. He was a 13-year-old boy who had already learned something that most adults never understand. He had learned that suffering teaches you who you really are. Most kings are raised to believe they are invincible. They are surrounded by flatterers and courtiers who tell them how magnificent they are. They grow up soft, entitled, and completely unprepared for actual hardship. Baldwin had been watching his own body fail since he was 9 years old. He had already faced the thing that terrified everyone else. Death was not some abstract concept to him. Death was already living in his skin. And once you have accepted that, once you have truly accepted that your body is dying while you are still inside it, political threats stop feeling quite so overwhelming. So Baldwin did something unexpected. He did not retreat, he did not hide. He took the throne, accepted the regents, and then quietly began learning how to rule anyway. He studied military tactics, he studied diplomacy, he studied the endless, exhausting game of managing noble egos that would have broken a healthier person. And all of this while his fingers were going numb, and his feet were losing sensation, and his skin was beginning to show the first visible signs of the disease that would eventually kill him. Here is something most history books do not tell you. Leprosy is slow. It does not kill you quickly like a sword or a plague. It takes years. It takes decades sometimes. It destroys you piece by piece, sensation by sensation, until you are essentially living inside a body that no longer feels like yours. And Baldwin knew this. He knew exactly what was coming. He had seen other lepers. He knew that eventually his face would distort, his fingers would curl inward, his eyesight would fail, and he would become something that made healthy people turn away in horror. He knew all of this, and he still got on his horse every morning and went to work. That is not bravery the way we usually talk about it. That is something else entirely. That is a kind of stubborn, almost absurd refusal to surrender. And it is the only reason the Kingdom of Jerusalem survived as long as it did. By the time Baldwin turned 16, his enemies had made their move. Saladin, the Sultan of Egypt and Syria, had spent years building an empire. He was patient, he was intelligent, he was everything the Crusader states feared in an opponent. And he had been watching the reports from Jerusalem with great interest. A boy king, a leper, a kingdom in chaos. From Saladin's perspective, this was the perfect moment to strike. In the autumn of 1177, Saladin assembled one of the largest armies the region had seen in decades. Estimates vary, but most historians agree he had somewhere between 20,000 and 30,000 soldiers, cavalry, infantry, archers, siege engines. This was not a raid. This was an invasion. Saladin was not interested in capturing a few border castles. He wanted to destroy the Kingdom of Jerusalem entirely. Baldwin, meanwhile, had maybe 500 knights and a few thousand infantry. The math was not just bad, it was apocalyptic. By any rational military calculation, the young king should have retreated to Jerusalem, fortified the city, and prayed for a miracle. But Baldwin did something that still confuses military historians today. He rode out to meet Saladin head-on. Let me describe what that ride must have felt like, because the details matter here. Baldwin was 16 years old. His hands were already partially numb. He could grip a sword, but he could not feel the hilt properly. He could hold his reins, but he could not sense the horse's movements the way a healthy rider would. Every step of that horse was a small act of faith, trusting that his body would not fail him at the wrong moment. And behind him, his tiny army followed a boy king toward an enemy force that outnumbered them by an almost comical margin. The Battle of Montgisard happened on November 25, 1177. It was, by any objective measure, a miracle. Baldwin's forces caught Saladin's army during a river crossing, which is every general's nightmare. An army crossing a river is vulnerable. It is spread out. It cannot maneuver. And Baldwin, despite his age, despite his illness, despite everything working against him, recognized the opportunity immediately. He charged. A teenage Leper King with numb hands and failing nerves led a cavalry charge directly into the largest army in the region. And somehow, impossibly, it worked. Saladin's forces panicked. They broke. They fled. Thousands of Saladin's soldiers were killed or captured. Saladin himself barely escaped, riding away on a camel with a small bodyguard while Baldwin's knights hunted him through the darkness. The Battle of Montgisard became legend. Poets wrote about it. Chroniclers describe Baldwin raising the true cross during the battle and receiving divine assistance. Saladin, who was not the kind of man who made excuses, spent the rest of his life calling Montgisard a disaster and a punishment from God. For one glorious moment, the Leper King had done the impossible. But here is the thing about impossible victories. They do not cure leprosy. Baldwin returned to Jerusalem as a hero. The nobles who had tried to control him now looked at him differently. The regents who had treated him like a child now understood that this child was something else entirely. But Baldwin knew what the chroniclers did not write down. During the battle, he had not felt his sword hand at all. He had swung based on memory and instinct, not sensation. He had held his reins through sheer force of will, because his fingers could no longer tell him if he was gripping too hard or too soft. And after the battle, when the adrenaline faded, he had looked down at his hands and seen something he had been trying not to see. They were changing. The shape of them was wrong. The skin was thickening in places, thinning in others. The leprosy that had been hiding inside his nerves was finally becoming visible. This is where most stories would turn sad. And it is sad. There is no way around that. A young man watching his body disintegrate while he tries to hold a kingdom together is objectively tragic. But Baldwin was not interested in tragedy. He was interested in survival, his kingdom's survival. And survival required him to do something even harder than winning battles. It required him to think about the future. Baldwin knew he would not live long enough to see his children grow up. He did not have children. He would never have children because leprosy and marriage do not mix well, and because the church had very specific opinions about lepers producing heirs. So Baldwin had to solve a problem that would have broken a healthier king. He had to find someone to rule after he died, and the people available to him were, to put it gently, not impressive. His sister Sibylla was beautiful and charming, and completely unprepared to run a kingdom under constant threat of annihilation. Her husband, Guy of Lusignan, was handsome, ambitious, and catastrophically incompetent. Baldwin knew this. Everyone knew this. Guy had the tactical awareness of aggressive furniture. He managed to lose battles that were theoretically unlosable. And yet, because of politics and marriage alliances and the endless complicated dance of noble families, Guy was the leading candidate to take over when Baldwin finally succumbed to his illness. Imagine knowing that the person who will inherit your kingdom is manifestly unqualified. Imagine knowing that your life's work, everything you have suffered for, everything you have sacrificed, will be handed to someone who will probably destroy it within months. Imagine knowing this while your own body is slowly turning against you, while your vision is starting to blur, while you can no longer feel your own feet touching the ground when you walk. That was Baldwin's reality at 18 years old. And he did not give up. That is the part I keep coming back to. He did not retreat to a monastery. He did not abdicate. He did not spend his remaining years in self-pity. He kept ruling. He kept fighting. He kept trying to hold his kingdom together, even though he absolutely knew that the moment he died, everything would probably fall apart. There is a psychological term for this. It is called the Cassandra complex. Knowing the future, knowing disaster is coming, and being powerless to stop it. But Baldwin was not powerless. He was just running out of time. By his early 20s, the disease had progressed significantly. He could no longer walk without assistance. His vision had deteriorated to the point where he could barely see across a room. His face had begun to change, the skin thickening and pulling in ways that made him look older than his years and distinctly unsettling. He wore heavy clothing to hide the lesions on his body. He wore gloves constantly, even indoors, even in summer, because his hands had become something he did not want his court to see. And still, he ruled. He held court from a chair because standing was too difficult. He listened to disputes, made judgments, negotiated with nobles who were already positioning themselves for the inevitable power vacuum. He received ambassadors from Europe, from Byzantium, from Saladin himself. And through all of it, he maintained a kind of calm, weary dignity that impressed even his enemies. Saladin, who had every reason to despise the young king who had humiliated him at Montgisard, reportedly spoke of Baldwin with respect bordering on admiration. When Baldwin fell ill during negotiations and had to be carried on a litter, Saladin sent his own physicians to treat him, not out of kindness exactly, out of something more complicated. The recognition that you are fighting someone worthy, the understanding that the world will be less interesting when they are gone. In 1183, when Baldwin was 22 years old and barely able to see or walk, he received news that Guy of Lusignan had done exactly what everyone feared he would do. Guy had provoked a confrontation with Saladin without adequate preparation. He had led the army into a position where Saladin could trap them without water. He had essentially handed Saladin a victory on a silver platter, and only desperate maneuvering by other commanders had prevented a complete disaster. Baldwin, from his sickbed, had to do something no king should ever have to do. He had to remove his own brother-in-law from command. He had to publicly humiliate the man who was supposed to succeed him. And then he had to crown his 5-year-old nephew as co-king, because a child was genuinely a better option than Guy of Lusignan. Can you imagine the exhaustion? Not physical exhaustion, though there was plenty of that, emotional exhaustion. The exhaustion of knowing that the people around you are actively working against your life's work. The exhaustion of trying to build something lasting while everyone else is playing their own petty games. The exhaustion of being the only adult in a room full of adults who refused to act like adults. Baldwin IV died in the spring of 1185. He was 24 years old. He had been king for 12 years. 12 years of ruling while his body rotted around him. 12 years of fighting battles, negotiating treaties, managing egos, and watching his own reflection become increasingly unfamiliar. 12 years of knowing exactly how his story would end, and choosing to keep going anyway. His body was buried in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem. His tomb was destroyed centuries later, which feels fitting somehow. Even in death, nothing about his existence was allowed to remain simple. Within 2 years of his death, everything he had fought to preserve collapsed. Guy of Lusignan, despite being stripped of command, somehow maneuvered his way back into power after Baldwin died. He led the army to the catastrophic Battle of Hattin in 1187, where Saladin destroyed the Crusader forces and captured Guy himself. Jerusalem fell to Saladin shortly afterward. The kingdom Baldwin had spent his entire short life defending was gone. But here is the thing I keep thinking about. Baldwin knew this would happen. He absolutely knew it. He had spent years trying to prevent it, and he had failed. Not because he was weak, not because he made the wrong choices, but because you cannot save people who refuse to be saved. You cannot build something permanent on a foundation of human egotism and short-term thinking. And you certainly cannot convince ambitious fools to set aside their ambitions for the sake of something larger than themselves. So why did he try? Why did Baldwin IV spend 12 years fighting a losing battle he knew he would lose? Why did he get on his horse at Montgisard when every rational calculation said he should retreat? Why did he keep ruling when his own body was telling him to lie down and never get up again? Because that is what kings do. Not the fairy tale kings, not the movie kings, the real ones, the ones who understand that ruling is not a privilege, it is a burden. It is waking up every morning to 1,000 problems you cannot solve. It is making decisions that will get people killed no matter what you choose. It is carrying the weight of everyone else's expectations while your own body slowly fails. It is being hated by people you are trying to protect. It is dying young, exhausted, and probably bitter, and hoping that someone, somewhere, will remember that you tried. And this brings us back to the question I asked at the beginning. Why wouldn't you last a day as King Baldwin IV? Not because you are weak, not because you are lazy, not because you lack courage, but because you have never had to face the thing that Baldwin faced every single morning of his adult life. The knowledge that your own body is killing you, the knowledge that everyone around you is waiting for you to fail. The knowledge that even if you succeed, even if you win every battle and outmaneuver every enemy, you will still die young and watch your life's work crumble. That is not a life, that is a sentence. And Baldwin served every day of it without complaint. We romanticize medieval kings. We imagine thrones and crowns and adoring subjects. We forget that being a king meant being a target. It meant never sleeping peacefully. It meant watching your children die of diseases we now cure with antibiotics. It meant knowing that your closest ally might poison you tomorrow. It meant carrying the hopes of thousands of people who would turn on you the moment you disappointed them. Baldwin IV carried all of that while his nerves died one by one. He carried it while his vision failed. He carried it while his face became something that made children cry. He carried it while Saladin's armies massed on his borders and his own nobles plotted against him. He carried it because someone had to. And when he could not carry it anymore, when his body finally gave out, he died quietly in Jerusalem, while the people who would destroy everything he built waited impatiently for his heart to stop beating. There is a word for this. It is not bravery, it is not heroism, it is not nobility. The word is endurance, pure, stubborn, unreasonable endurance, the refusal to stop when everything tells you to stop, the decision to keep going even when going is pointless, the choice to stand up one more time when standing up requires everything you have left. That is what made Baldwin IV different. Not his victories, not his intelligence, not his famous charge at Montgisard, his endurance, his willingness to suffer while smiling, his ability to look at a future he knew would be terrible and walk toward it anyway with his eyes open. Could you do that? Could you wake up tomorrow knowing that your body is dying and your kingdom is dying and everyone you trust is either incompetent or treacherous? Could you put on your gloves to hide your hands, and your robes to hide your skin, and your crown to hide your fear? Could you sit on a throne while your nerves quietly shut down and pretend everything is fine because the alternative is chaos? Most of us cannot. And that is fine. That is normal. That is human. Most of us are not built for that kind of endurance. Most of us break under much smaller weights. A bad breakup, a difficult job, a disappointing medical diagnosis. We crumble. We retreat. We look for someone else to carry the burden. Baldwin IV did not have that option. There was no one else. There was only a teenage leper and a kingdom that needed him to be something more than human. And somehow, impossibly, he was. His story does not have a happy ending. History rarely does. Saladin took Jerusalem, The Crusader states eventually collapsed. The boy who had once led a miracle charge at Montgisard became a footnote, a curiosity, a king with leprosy who died young. But footnotes matter. Curiosities matter. Stories of impossible endurance matter because they remind us what human beings are capable of when they have no other choice. We tell stories about Baldwin IV not because he won, he lost. Everything he built fell apart. We tell stories about him because he tried, because he got on his horse when he could barely feel the reins, because he raised his sword when he could barely feel the hilt, because he looked at certain death and certain failure and certain destruction and said, "Not yet, not today. Today we fight." That is not inspiration, that is not motivation. That is something rawer, something that looks like all of us on our worst days, getting out of bed when we would rather disappear, putting one foot in front of the other when every step hurts, choosing to exist in a world that seems determined to break us. Baldwin IV was not a hero. Heroes are clean. Heroes win. Heroes ride off into sunsets. Baldwin was a young man dying slowly in a hot, dusty kingdom full of people who did not deserve his sacrifice, and he kept going anyway. That is why you would not last a day as him. Not because you are weak, but because no one should have to. No one should have to carry that weight. No one should have to smile while their body falls apart. No one should have to fight battles they know they will lose. But sometimes there is no one else. Sometimes the burden falls on you whether you asked for it or not. And sometimes, on very rare occasions, someone steps up and carries it anyway. Not perfectly, not without complaint, not without moments of doubt and exhaustion and despair. But they carry it. They carry it until they cannot carry it anymore. And then they carry it a little further. That is the real story of King Baldwin IV. Not the Leper King, not the miracle child, not the victor of Montgisard. Just a boy, just a sick boy, just a dying boy who refused to stop being king until the very end. And the sun set over Jerusalem, and the kingdom fell, and Saladin walked through the gates his enemy had defended for so long. And somewhere, in a forgotten tomb, the bones of a leper king waited for nothing at all. But the story remained. The story of the boy who should have never been king, who should have never won a battle, who should have never lasted a day. And yet he did. He lasted 12 years. He lasted until his body simply ran out of time. Could you last one day? Probably not. But here is the strange thing. You do not have to. The question was never whether you could be Baldwin IV. The question was whether you could be something else, something smaller but no less real. Something that looks like getting through today, even though today is hard. Something that looks like choosing to try, even though trying is exhausting. Something that looks like endurance, and that, I think, is the only lesson history ever really offers. Not that we should be heroes, not that we should win impossible battles, but that we should keep going. One more day, one more hour, one more moment. Because sometimes that is all anyone can do. And sometimes, on very rare occasions, that is enough. The fan is still running. The lights are still dim. And somewhere, in a history book no one is reading, a young king with numb hands and failing eyesight sits on a throne he never asked for, waiting for an army he knows will come, knowing he will probably lose. And he does not run, and he does not hide. He just sits there in the heat and the dust and the quiet, being a king until he is not a king anymore. That is why you would not last a day, because no one would, no one should. But he did. And that is worth remembering.